Okay, hello everyone. I'm Sherine El Taraboulsi-McCarthy. I'm the director of NatCen International, which is a global social policy program at the National Centre for Social Research in London. I'm delighted to be here today and to be moderating this important and timely discussion that is about a topic that's very close to my heart. I started exploring the Arab civic and philanthropic space ages ago, about 15 years ago, and have been very keenly following the expansion of literature, data, and analysis in that space since then. And I'm delighted that the Arab Foundations Forum has taken steps towards publishing and putting together this report. So I'd like to congratulate them for that. Now, before I get started and introduce the speakers and the excellent panel that we have today, I just want to point out that in this session, we really want to focus and discuss two areas. The first one is about the shrinking of the Arab civic space, why it has shrunk, the causes of it, but also the coping strategies by key actors. The second area that we're keen to look at is the role of international donors and the scope and the space for complementarity between international and local civil society actors. And we will dig a lot more deeply and perhaps even more critically into what we mean by localization in practice in Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine. Now, joining me in the discussion today, as I said, is an excellent panel of experts and leaders. And I'm really, really privileged to be engaging them in this discussion. Naila Farouky, as you all know, is the CEO of the Arab Foundations Forum. Heba Abou Shnief is the Senior Director of Research at the Arab Foundations Forum as well. Marie-Noelle, AbiYaghi, Co-Director of the Center for Social Sciences Research and Action in Lebanon. Marie-Noelle has a very impressive background in CV, they all do. So I'm really giving you a very quick kind of snippets of information about them. She specializes in the sociology of political processes, contentious politics, and the social questions within the MENA region. Firas Jaber is the co-founder and a researcher at AFF in Palestine. Firas has completed and authored a number of studies and books. He also supervised public opinion polls within the region. Also with us today is Hend Abdel Meguid, who is the Executive Director of Terous Foundation for Development in Egypt. She's a former accountant, economist, and a business development expert. And last but not least, Ahmed Awad, who is the Director of the Phenix Center for Economic and Informatics Studies in Jordan. Ahmed has dedicated most of his professional life to the promotion and defense of human rights, with a particular emphasis on socioeconomic human rights. Now, before I hand over to Naila to give an introduction to the report, I'd like to point out a few housekeeping issues. Now, I hope for those who are going to be using simultaneous translation, you've got 3 channels for translation that are available. There's Arabic, there's English, and there's an off channel. So select the channel that is most suitable for you, the language that you'd like to hear. And please do stay muted unless for the speakers, do stay muted unless you are speaking, just to make sure that this is a smooth experience for everyone. Now, this is with regard to the language. In terms of if you want to put questions, there's a Q&A button. If you want to send the panelists any questions, please do not include them in the chat box. And if you find questions in the Q&A section that you would like to address, just please, you can still add it if you want to, but we will try to summarize and identify the questions that are most pertinent. We may not be able to address all questions during the session. I always do try, but I will try to make sure that, we're not repeating the same questions to the panelists. Now, at this point, I'd like to hand over to Naila for her to introduce the report, give us a little bit of background on the context. Why is this report important? Why is it important now? What is AFF's plans for this report? And why? What are the implications for enabling the Arab civic space, which is the focus of the study? So over to you, Naila.
Thank you so much, Shireen. And thank you so much to our panelists. Really, I'm so excited to get right into this. So I don't want to take up too much of our time, but I do want to give a quick kind of overview, contextual update as to why this report is so important to us and what we feel the impact of this will be in years to come. So, this has really, really been a labor of love and a labor of and a testament to perseverance and our commitment to engaging Arab researchers in producing Arabic language research as well as English language, but also research that is conducted by the region, for the region, about the region. And it's been a commitment of AFF at least since I came on board in 2014. It's taken some time for us to get here. And honestly, for us to be launching our first kind of report on the enabling environment in 4 countries across the region seems like it's just something I'm extremely proud of. And I'm extremely proud of everyone who participated with us. We received so much response, so much more than we expected. And I know Heba will give you all an overview of the report and the key findings of the report. And then this amazing lineup of panelists will get a little bit more kind of deep into each of their individual countries. And these are all people who contributed to the report as well. So, from a kind of broader perspective, we know that at least over the last 15 years, the landscape and the ecosystem of Arab philanthropy and civil society has been facing some challenges, to put it very mildly. And, particularly since the Arab Spring, we've seen a lot of restriction kind of being imposed on the sector throughout several countries in the region. We received this funding from the very generous support of the EU as a subcontract, as a sub-grant by Wings, which is a global network of networks that AFF is very proud to serve on the board of and is also very proud to be a member of. And so we're very grateful for that funding because it really allowed us to look at 4 countries across the region and 4 relatively diverse countries with also some similarities. But, we're looking at Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, and Palestine. And we're given this opportunity to do a little bit of a deep dive into what are the challenges in this space, what is enabling about the space, and what can still do with some amendments and some changes to make it a little bit more enabling for us to have more impact and to be a bit more purposeful about how we set up our ecosystem. And then, the most exciting thing for me about all of this is the outcomes of this report in terms of what it offers us as recommendations. And as much as, we can talk ad nauseum about the challenges that we face, we're really not, it doesn't get us anywhere if we can't come up with at least a set of concrete recommendations for how we can move forward, right? Which is, the hopeful, optimistic side that I hope we can all get on board with. So I won't take this any further, just to say that, we are hoping that the Arabic language version of this report will also be finalized very shortly. It's just going through a final design phase. We're very proud that this is going to be in Arabic and English to add to our Arabic language knowledge base. And I will transfer it back to you, Shireen. And, I'm very excited for this to get started. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Naila. And I think what you said about it being, about strengthening the data infrastructure on philanthropy and civic engagement from within the region and by researchers who are very deeply familiar with the context, the issues, the challenges, as well as the opportunities that are there. I think this is a really crucial point that keeps getting sidelined and missed out upon in the international research that's been published over the past decade or more on the Arab philanthropic and civic space. So again, congratulations on that. And about the report itself, over to you, Heba. What are the key findings of the reports, the key highlights that you'd like to put forward to refresh all our memories and to share with the audience? Over to you. Yeah, you're muted. Go ahead.
Good afternoon and Masā al-Khair, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. So I'll try to keep it short, although has been a very difficult task to kind of pick out the main takeaways, because the report, I have to say, is dense. It's full of examples and models, and this can only be attributed to the fabulous insights, the sense of community that we felt when we were interviewing the infrastructure support organizations, the foundations, associations. So thanks to them, we have this very insightful report. If we look at, so basically, this mapping looks into the 4 countries, as you know. It looks at 4 areas: governance and policy changes, legal framework, infrastructure support, finance, sustainability. So the idea, as Naila mentioned, is not just to look at the problems and present an analysis, but also to look at the priorities and areas for action. So we find through the report in several sections that we're describing, from the study participants' input and the literature review, how we can take this enabling environment forward positively. We had 23 semi-structured interviews. I'm sorry, I think, I just want to make sure that, we had 23 semi-structured interviews with, this is like kind of a brief taxonomy of the organizations that we talked to. We pilot tested the interview questions kind of to get a grounded understanding of what the issues are in each context. And it also felt more participatory. So instead of a conceptually driven understanding, the participants themselves helped us kind of anchor the research into the issues that matter in their context. And we also put a particular emphasis on anchoring the findings in national level research. So we know that there's international organizations that have done studies on the civic space and very good studies, but we really kind of tapped into the knowledge in the region. The Phenix Center, the Center for Social Science Research Action that are presented in this panel, also AFF, and looked at the research that they produced and other organizations that are listed in the, and we found a wealth of knowledge. So, as you know, the study talks about resilience, growth, and sustainability. In terms of resilience, the region is undergoing multiple crises, and here's just a list of these issues. In some contexts, it's multiple issues happening at the same time. In Lebanon, it's the Beirut port blast. And this is really, and if we took a deep dive to look at the COVID impact. And what we saw is, of course, the overstretched capacities of CSOs to respond to the shifting needs. And so this really put a strain on the organizational and operational capacities of the CSOs, but also operating the lockdown restrictions. So that put a lot of tension on their operations. And this also manifested in a digital divide. So there were organizations that had the digital infrastructure, so they were able to kind of keep the momentum. The shift to the uptake of digital tools was very, very quick. And we give an example in the report of the civil society organization working in the space of orphans and child care. They did not have the digital infrastructure set. So this meant that their donation took a deep in the COVID context. Other organizations or the big foundation, for example, I think Masr al-Khair, they already had the digital infrastructure. So they weren't really affected as much in terms of their donation. Another thing that we found is that there were some flexible grant-making practices from the foundation's international donors. So some but there were few. For example, Swedish Foundation, they had a request for a proposal for an emergency fund in response to COVID. In Lebanon, there was the Shabaka project that they're working on institutional capacity building of CSOs and the EU delegation. So what they did was very interesting. They gave like this, they gave more flexibility. They gave the CSOs the chance to assess what they needed in this shifting context. So multi-purpose cash assistance, rehabilitation, restoration of stores in the case of the micro and small and medium enterprises that they're working with. So that was some of the examples about the flexible grant making practices. But what really, what we saw from the COVID is that the CSOs, despite the kind of the shocks, they were frontline responders to COVID. But if we look at this resilience from a longer term perspective, there's this a lot of emphasis in the conversations that we had about the building resilience in terms of the long-term capacities of CSOs. So it's been, this project-based, time-bound funding or emphasis is not going to work on the long term. And there was a study participant that specifically talked about this, the contrast between the INGOs and the local CSOs. So that you find that the INGOs are able to move from one phase to the next, from a crisis to a more transitional stage and more kind of developmental in a with relatively much ease, and also the kind of they have these learning and institutional capacities to transition from one stage to the next, which is missing in the local CSOs. But also, and another thing that was underscored was this tension between the humanitarian relief and sustainable development kind of agenda. So as we know, most of the funds and the programmatic focus is on has been on humanitarian relief because of the crisis, the multiple crises in the context. But there was a questioning about how long this will remain, because if we the chairman of the INGO forum, for example, said we have an expensive humanitarian relief system in Jordan, but it's not fit for a 10-year strategic programming in the context of a protracted refugee crisis. Another example is the Lebanese the Lebanese refugee camps. Each year, on a yearly basis, they have this. They suffer from inadequate shelter. So there's fuel and energy shortages. Without any concrete housing solutions to replace these tents, this is a repeated kind of a challenge, and without the sustainable development kind of focus, it will continue. Another thing that was also spotlighted is this the social contract in Lebanon. So it's not this state-civil society relationship without a clear exit, no clear exit for the CSOs. It's likely to result in distorted outcomes. Palestine, they called for an institutional structure for crisis response to help withstand these shocks and minimize disruption. So that's regarding the kind of what civic actors believe are the needs in terms of responding to the resilience to crisis, but also moving into a more transformational agenda where there's an equilibrium of this humanitarian relief and sustainable development agenda. So another thing that we looked in the big theme that we looked in the lens was the civil society growth. We wanted to understand the health of the sector. And so while the civil society, and you'll see in the table here some figures, because of the access to data, it's not publicly available, it was kind of difficult to get much detailed or disaggregated data. But we looked at these years, 2000, 2015, and 2021. And you'll notice that in the three countries that the number of CSOs are expanding, absolute numbers. But if we look at these numbers in a per capita basis, per 100,000 inhabitants, you'll see some sluggish growth, and there's kind of a discrepancy. So in Jordan, for example, in Egypt and Palestine, the CSOs per 1,000 inhabitants or per capita doubled. In Jordan, it tripled. Lebanon, on the other hand, even though it leads the 4 countries in terms of the CSO per capita, so you see it's like 127, but the growth was slower, 34% from 95 to 127. And we kind of attribute this maybe to the, maybe there's this, because of the maturity of civil society in Lebanon, it could be that the demand is meeting the supply, or that there could be limited absorptive capacity. There's a saturation. And Shireen, you mentioned the expansion of civil society and contraction and in response to the opening and the closing of the civic space. And we see this clearly in the wake of the Arab Spring. So in 2011, there has been a spike in the registered civil society organizations in Egypt, for example. In Lebanon, the kind of the insights that we got in the literature, the research, the evidence is that there has also been an expansion in civil society, both the registered and the informal, in response to COVID and with the port blast. At the same time, when we talk about contraction in Egypt in 2017, and that's when the new NGO law 170 of 2017, there was a decline, 2% decline in the number of CSO registered. So the conclusion is that there's a correlation between CSO growth, crises, and civic space, but also funding. So when there's funding, of course, there's civil society expansion. When there's a decline, there's shutdown, there's downsizing. Okay. We asked about the civic space, whether there's been a notable change in COVID, and all study participants suggested that they do operate in a restricted space. However, there was significant change in Jordan and Palestine during the COVID lockdown. So these challenges had to do with the right to assemble and the excessive and kind of discriminate application of restrictions to movement. So in the case of Gaza, CSOs were not able, they didn't have the permits, and they were not able to reach their beneficiaries. But also in Jordan, there was a decline in funding approvals by the Ministerial Council Committee that's responsible for CSO funding approvals during COVID. And this is Phenix Center has done a research on this. Okay. So when you asked about the legal framework and in the literature, I think it's not so much the legal framework as broadly speaking, or it's not. It specifically had to do with how the laws actually are executed and interpreted by the oversight bodies. So in Palestine, for example, there's another layer of complexity in terms of the multiplicity of oversight bodies. And here you can see that there's like 7 bodies that are kind of coordinating with the registered civil society, whether in receiving reports, oversight, kind of investigation. But also another challenge was the registration process. So most of, like in Lebanon and Palestine, it's like a notification system. And recently in Egypt, the reformed aspect of the law 149 of 2019 is that there's registration by notification. But in reality, this process really involves extensive application to be filled, supporting documentation. There's also the funding approval delays that can range from months to even over a year. And what this means is for organizations that are operating, it's really at extreme situations, it could be shut down, and others it's just closing a program. But also in our conversations and our study participants questioned the inequitable application of regulations. So it's the fact that the small organizations, the community organizations have to comply with the same regulations as the larger, the big organizations. That's not perceived as fair. And also the fact that the organizations with an established history have to go through the same process whenever they need to apply for funding permits. This was also questioned. But when we talk about, again, restrictions, they mainly narrowed it down into two biggest challenges, civic actors. The discretionary banking practices, restricting access to finance, counterterrorism was cited as the main driver, but they also felt that the restrictions exceeded the requirements of the Financial Action FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. And there's surveys that have been done, a survey on Lebanese CSOs, they experienced bank restrictions, and also we have the banking crisis, and just a recent one in Lebanon, and also in Palestine, freezing of bank accounts in November in 2021, but it seems to be not just, it seems to be a kind of a tool for the occupied territories to kind of restrict and circumscribe Palestinian CSOs. So yes, and I'm almost there, I promise you. Regarding the civil society, finance, sustainability, now this is a big issue that we wanted to spotlight. And really what is causing this kind of the structural issue or systemic issue, it has to do with this donor-grantee power dynamic. Now, in our interviews, especially in Jordan, Palestine, and Lebanon, there was a lot of emphasis on the localization agenda and how to bring back the power, the representation, and the agency to the local actors. And this dependency is kind of reinforced by the this kind of imbalance between the institutional versus the overhead and institutional cost versus the programmatic. And also the excessive reporting system that are to meet the donor requirements. And so this really takes a lot of energy and time from the CSOs to focus on what the issues that matter to them and their agenda, and executing their agenda. So under investment in the long-term institutional capacities, but also the challenge of the CSOs themselves. So it's not just the localization agenda, but the overstretched capacities with so much demands on CSOs and crises and these challenges. So the limited commitment from a realistic point of view to put the time and to develop and diversify the income sources is a challenge. But there is kind of a concern that the COVID pandemic and these other macro level pressures, for example, the Russian-Ukraine war, would kind of push the trend still towards shorter funding horizons. The solutions that were proposed, increasing core funding. So the evidence is that, and I think the NGO Development Center of Palestine, their intermediary foundation that provides grants for civil society, they said they believe that core funding had played a key role in promoting the sustainability of civil society organizations, multi-year grants instead of the project kind of time-bound project kind of focus, and endowment building. Another thing was the holistic and long-term investment in building institutional capacities. So we also have examples, and I really do encourage you to read the report because it has some very good examples about what's happening and the good practices from the region. Also, they wanted to see expanded role for Arab philanthropy and indigenous philanthropic models, and probably the panel will kind of highlight what the challenges are in terms of this expansion. Another thing was the good practices. So not everybody in the sector has access or with the kind of, there is a growth of databases and knowledge, but more needs to happen in terms of the exchange, the knowledge exchange. So we know what's happening in Palestine, in Jordan, and this cross kind of learning and peer-to-peer learning. Another solution was the representation of the CSOs, national actors in the decision-making structures. So there's a gap here across the countries to have this meaningful and continuous representation on local aid structures. And also the kind of a supply side problem is that there isn't any independent representative bodies for CSOs. If they are, they're kind of weak. And I just wanted to point out there that there are models in the region that represent good practices. So, and they have done it in terms of achieving income sustainability. The Madani is one example, and Arkansas from Lebanon, where they have diversified income streams. Another challenge that we also spotlighted is the lack of representative data on CSOs and philanthropy. Their focus areas, investments, and impact. So the digitalization and connectivity has helped spur this growth of databases, and our partners here have some experience in this regard. But still, the fierce scrutiny and accountability still restrains civil society and Arab philanthropy from sharing their work and impact measurement. There's a widely shared view that private wealth is not to be trusted to achieve the public good. That was kind of flagged by one of the study participants. And the perception of CSOs receiving grants from philanthropy organizations and donors are incompetent and corrupt. That's kind of, the media plays a big role in this. And also the chronic underinvestment in infrastructure support and knowledge building. So these are the challenges that have to do with the data infrastructure that you mentioned earlier, Shnief. This proposed solutions, building awareness, again, that civil society workers are professionals. The infrastructure support organizations need to build a narrative trust in Arab philanthropy and CSOs. Accreditation award, and through award recognition or government appraisals of foundations could help increase the kind of the trustworthiness, the trust building, and the execution of right to information laws, because access to social data was also a missing piece. Okay, and so the final point that I wanted to talk about was the representative body. So there's limited representation of CSOs in the institutionalized state CSO dialogue, and when there is actually a few of the big and visible actors dominate the scene. So this really kind of makes this put spotlight on this inequitable kind of representation. But also when we talk about the coalition building, because there was a lot of discussion about the role of and focus on the role of coalition building and addressing these structural issues and kind of emphasizing the voice of civil society in decision making. But the vast majority of coalition building efforts tend to be communication driven. They're time bound and project based. Yeah, that's okay when the issue is kind of getting some short-term achievement, but when this continuous dialogue, then coalitions need to be more sustainable. There's also this lack of a sector-driven character. So broad-based coalitions that represent civil society are very few, but we do have an example of one in Palestine when they changed the social protection law, and Firas here is actually participated in this coalition. The solutions, learning from regional coalitions. So there's Hemam, Jonah, INGO Forum in Jordan. Capitalizing also on the role of infrastructure support, because the convening space is there. Networking and advocacy role of infrastructure support is very important to tap into. And these examples that were mentioned, whether it's Hemam, Jonathan, Ajo, and Jordan in particular, and there's also the woman kind of women issues in Lebanon. We found that their success depended on having a clear cause and commonly shared agenda, a strong coordinating structure, and also an equal balance of power where all the different sizes of organizations are equally represented and have an equal voice, but also having funding streams was also pinpointed for work plan implementation. With this, I come to the end of my presentation, and looking forward to hearing your feedback and comments.
Thank you so much, Heba, for your excellent presentation and for really a very rich report. I mean, I've got so many questions going on in my head as you were presenting. I read the report 3 times now, and every time I go back to it, I see, you know, other sections that can be kind of pulled out and developed into their own report. So I think there's a lot more, you know, research that needs to be done in this area to build on this report as well. Now, just to kind of underscore some of the key points that Heba talked about, I think for me the report really confirms that the Arab civic space remains very much constrained, right? And it's constrained by a set of factors that are known to all of us. Some of them are domestic. You know, the regulatory environment can be too restrictive, can be too unpredictable, can be very selective in terms of the type of organizations that they would be restrictive towards. You know, I'm thinking here particularly of human rights organizations, for example. There are some contextual problems, you know, the health shock of COVID-19, and broader contextual issues related to socioeconomic context. And then there are more kind of external or extraneous blockages and barriers that also, you know, we've all experienced across our different roles. You know, power inequities between international donors and local civil society organizations, broader geopolitical dynamics. Heba also mentioned the broader counterterrorism regime and how that gets interpreted. I've actually written a paper about that, how the broader counterterrorism regime gets interpreted at the local level in Arab countries. And I think that what the report shows is that despite all of these challenges, and I think this is where, you know, the thrust of the argument really lies for me, is that despite all of these challenges, it's very much alive and kicking, right? So the Arab civic space is still very much alive, is still very much indispensable to broad parts of the population, and that that Arab civic space also needs a lot of unpacking. You know, it's not a single unit of analysis. You know, as we reflect on the case studies of Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, and Palestine, each country has experienced those external, internal, domestic barriers in different ways, and those barriers have changed over time. And so there's also a need to kind of, you know, depart from looking at the Arab civic space as one single unit of analysis or one single type of engagement. We really start thinking about the specificities of each of those contexts and each of those countries. So I would like to, at this point, you know, engage with the panelists and also, you know, go back to Heba with some questions based on her presentation. But first, I'm interested to ask Ahmed from Jordan. I mean, let me start with Jordan. You know, Ahmed, you've led several human rights coalitions in Jordan. Could you give us your thoughts on how you've experienced the shrinking of the Arab civic space that the report outlines and puts forward? And what, in your opinion, are the causes of that restrictive environment? And have you seen those restrictions kind of change because of COVID-19? Over to you.
شكرا Shireen. يعني أسئلة عديدة وما بعرف إذا الوقت المتاح لي راح يمكنني من إني أجيب عليها كلها، ولكن بشكل مقتضب أستطيع القول بأنه منظمات المجتمع المدني في المنطقة العربية وخاصة تلك التي تعمل في مجال الدفاع عن حقوق الإنسان وتعزيز مسارات التنمية المستدامة بتخوض حقيقة معارك على أكثر من صعيد. وبذات الوقت المعركة الأولى معركة سياسية في الدفاع عن مساحة وجودها وآليات عملها وحقها بالوجود وأن تكون مستقلة وأن تعمل من أجل تحقيق أهدافها. هذا جانب. جانب ثاني هي بتخوض معركة تحقيق الأهداف نفسها، يعني قديش في صعوبات وقديش في قوى اجتماعية وقوى اقتصادية داخل مجتمع تضع عراقيل أمامها. وقضية أخرى لها علاقة بأنه طبيعة عمل المجتمع المدني التنموي الحقوقي تطور بحيث أصبح بده احترافية عالية بالعمل، ومنظومة التعليم في المنطقة منظومة تراجعت بشكل ملموس خلال العقود الماضية، وبالتالي هذا أدى إلى بذل جهد كبير في تهيئة وتمكين الشباب والشابات من أجل العمل بهذا المستوى الرفيع من المهنية اللي بيتطلب عمل منظمات المجتمع المدني. المجتمع المدني كما هو معروف يعني بيفتقر للحد الأدنى من البيئة الممكنة لكي يقوم بأداء دوره. ومع ذلك المجتمع المدني الحقوقي والتنموي، وأنا بركز على هذا السياق في الحديث لأنه احنا عندنا آلاف منظمات المجتمع المدني في المنطقة، لا بل عشرات الآلاف. الجزء الأكبر منها هي منظمات ذات طابع خيري، وجزء غير قليل هي منظمات مرتبطة بالسلطات السياسية والحكومات. ومنظمات المجتمع المدني متنوعة حقيقة، وأحيانا ومن الصعب تناولها كلها بشكل موحد، لأنه في منظمات مجتمع مدني على سبيل المثال تمثل مصالح العمال، في عندنا منظمات مجتمع مدني تمثل مصالح أصحاب الأعمال، في منظمات مجتمع مدني بتشتغل من أجل تحقيق بعض الأهداف الصحية مثل منع التدخين، محاربة السرطان إلى آخره، وفي منظمات مجتمع مدني تشتغل بتسويق العوامل المضرة في المجتمع، وهذا حق الجميع بالوجود، ولكن يعني علينا أن نركز أكثر على من هو المجتمع المدني اللي حقيقة بيتعرض لهاي التحديات ومساحة العمل عنده تضيق يوما بعد يوم. هي المنظمات اللي بتبذل جهد كبير من أجل أن تكون مستقلة، بمعنى أن تكون تعمل وفق رؤيتها، رؤية أعضائها، الرؤية التي أنشأت من أجلها لحل المشكلات التي تعمل من أجلها، وعلى وجه الخصوص القضايا المرتبطة بحقوق الإنسان الأساسية، الحقوق المدنية والسياسية والاجتماعية والثقافية والاقتصادية وحتى الحق في التنمية. وبالتالي هناك في تنوع بالرؤى. العبء الأكبر يقع على عاتق هاي المنظمات اللي بتشتغل في هذا المجال، وبالتالي أي جهد حقيقة يؤدي بتقوم فيه هاي المنظمات يواجه بتحدي أساسي، إنه البيئة السياسية غير ممكنة، وارتباط في غالبية الدول العربية ومن بينها الأردن العمل في مشاريع محددة بموافقات مسبقة من السلطات السياسية، هذا بحد ذاته يعني التحدي الأساسي. كيف يمكن لمنظمة مجتمع مدني تعمل من أجل تعزيز الحريات العامة، تعمل من أجل الدفاع عن حرية الرأي والإعلام وإلى آخره، في ذات الوقت هي من أجل العمل عليها ومن أجل حتى قبول المنح للعمل في هذا المجال عليها أن تحصل على موافقات مسبقة من الحكومة. حتى المؤسسات اللي بتقوم بدور رقابي، وإحنا بنواجه هذا الحكي عندنا في الأردن، مؤسسة بدها تقوم بالرقابة وتدعم مسارات الشفافية والحوكمة على المؤسسات الرسمية، كيف يمكن لها أن تمارس دورها باستقلالية في ذات الوقت اللي بدي يوافق على أن تعمل في هذا المجال هي المؤسسة التي ستخضع لرقابتها؟ هذا واحد. اثنين، صار في يعني في البيئة السياسية صار في تمادي أكثر، ليس فقط بإعطاء الموافقات أو منعها، وإنما بفرض آلية تطبيق للمشاريع والأنشطة الخاصة بهذه المشاريع تحت إشراف المؤسسات الرسمية. على سبيل المثال منظمات مجتمع مدني في الأردن بدها تراقب أداء وزارة العمل، الحكومة توافق لها عليها بس على أن تقوم بإنفاذ كل الأنشطة تحت إشراف وزارة العمل. كيف يمكن ذلك؟ وكذلك وزارة العدل، كذلك وزارة التنمية الاجتماعية إلى آخره. في هذا الإطار حقيقة الموضوع سياسي، واحيانا بعض المسارات يعني هي المضحك المبكي بتكون. يعني كنا في الاردن مثال يمكن ان يستفاد منه، يقولوا لنا انه يا عمي ما في عنوان واحد للمجتمع المدني، كيف بدنا نعمل معكم احنا كونسلتيشنز في بعض القضايا؟ رحنا اجتهدنا وعملنا تحالف سميناه هيئه تنسيق مؤسسات المجتمع المدني، من حوالي 13 ل 15 منظمه مجتمع مدني تعمل في مجال تعزيز الحقوق وحماية الحقوق الإنسان الأساسية والتنمية. عندما تم تأسيس هذا التحالف رفضت الحكومة تسجيله، لا بل يتم رفض التعامل معه كإطار، وإنما يتم التعامل معه كأفراد. يعني وفي حرب، يعني حرب سياسية لحل هذا التحالف وإلغائه، باعتبار أن الصوت عندما يتوحد سيشكل ضغط، وهكذا. اللي بدي أحكيه أنه منظمات المجتمع المدني أيضا بتعمل في ذات الوقت في الوقت اللي بتقود فيه معارك في الجانب السياسي وفي الجانب المتعلق بتوسيع تحسين بيئة العمل لإلها مساحة الحرية، هي في ذات الوقت نتائج هذا العمل سينعكس عليها إيجابا أو سلبا. كل ما زادت استقلالية هذه المنظمات كل ما ضاقت الفرص أمامها بالعمل، وكل ما اقتربت من السلطة السياسية أكثر كل ما فتح لها المجال أكثر، وبالتالي خطابها تغير على حساب استقلاليتها، وبالتالي تصبح أحد أذرع السلطة السياسية. وهذا الحكي لا ينطبق على غالبية الدول العربية للأسف الشديد. للأسف الشديد منظمات المجتمع المدني في المنطقة العربية اللي بتشتغل في مجال تعزيز مسارات التنمية والدفاع عن حقوق الإنسان بمنظور مستقل تضيق أمامها الفرص يوم بعد يوم، وبحاجة إلى جهود دعم أكبر إلها. وهذا الدعم ليس بالضرورة أن يكون دعما ماليا عن طريق المنح، وإنما يكون عن طريق الدعم الفني والسياسي والتضامني بين منظمات المجتمع المدني اللي للأسف الشديد في المنطقة بالرغم كل القيود، وهذا يعني fortunate not unfortunate يعني رغم كل القيود التي مورست ضدها، إلا أنه أثبتت العديد من منظمات المجتمع المدني في كل دولنا أنه هي موجودة، وهي العاملين على قيادتها عندهم شغف عالي وباشن عالي من أجل الدفاع عن مصالحهم والدفاع وتحقيق رسالتهم. بظل عندي ملاحظة لها علاقة بالدراسة، يعني لما شفت بعض الجداول والمقارنات بتم التعامل مع منظمات المجتمع المدني باعتبارها الجمعيات. حقيقة لا، المجتمع المدني أوسع من الجمعيات. يعني في الأردن 6000 وكذا 6800 جمعية، بس ما أنا عندي كمان عشرات الشركات إن لم يكن مئات الشركات التي لا تهدف إلى تحقيق الربح. عندي أيضا نقابات، يعني من 46 عام حتى الآن، من 76 للآن في الأردن لم يسمح لأي مجموعة عمال أن يشكلوا نقابة عمالية. والمنظمات المهنية اللي بتنظم عمل الأطباء والمهندسين والمحامين هاي أصبحت مؤسسات شبه حكومية، العضوية فيها إلزامية وبتأخذ ضريبة من الناس ورسوم، ولا بل انه انظمه المنافع اللي بيحصلوا عليها الاطباء ومحامين والخلافيه هذه بياخذوها من الناس مش من اشتراكاتهم. وبالتالي يعني اصبحت هاي مؤسسات شبه رسميه شبه حكوميه تدار بالانتخاب، وليس الانتخاب المستقل، ايضا الانتخاب الحر. يعني في تدخلات ملموسه فيها. للاسف الشديد هناك في علاقه شك بين منظمات المجتمع المدني وبين الحكومات والسلطات السياسية. هذا بيضعف دورها وبيضعف قدرتها على التطور في المستقبل.
Thank you, Ahmed. I think you've made really important points. You haven't touched upon the impact of COVID yet, and maybe we can get back to that at a later point. But I think the two really kind of significant points that you've made, one of them is the impact of politics, the space that politics occupies in terms of restricting the civic space in the case of Jordan, in the case of also, I think you referred to other Arab contexts. And then the other point is when we refer to the Arab civic space, and that's one of the questions that I think the report tries to respond to, but it's also something for us all to reflect on. What do we mean by an Arab civic space over here? I mean, what you mentioned about syndicates, about trade unions, about civil society organizations that are associations affiliated with government. There's just so many different types and so many different legal frameworks that govern the operations of those organizations. And again, as I mentioned earlier, is that the Arab civic space is not a single unit of analysis. The laws that govern the civic space in Tunisia, completely different from Egypt, completely different from Jordan. And the amount of agency that is there is also kind of varies from one to the other. But across the board, the human rights element, the rights-based components of that civic space, regardless of where it is very much restricted and it is very, very political. So I'll stop there and I'll move to my other panelists, and particularly to Firas, reflecting on also what Ahmed's mentioned about the complexities of the Arab civic space. I think, Palestine is particularly complex. And I've actually, a few years ago, I did a study that looked at the humanitarian donorship in Palestine and the impact of counterterrorism policies on humanitarian donorship in West Bank and Gaza. And just the level of complexity that is there, and then so many different layers of control that are there are quite really kind of really worrying, right? So my question to you is, again, about your experience. How have you experienced changes in the civic landscape there? And can you speak to me about what have been the coping strategies? I'm always interested not just in what the problems are, but how people address those problems, the level of agency that is there. How have organizations coped and adapted with a lot of those restrictions? And again, my research has pointed to some kind of fascinating stories about how people come together to make things happen with or without international donorship being there. So I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about that. Over to you, Firas. Firas, you're muted. I'm sorry.
شكرا شيرين. ممكن أول شيء أنا حاب أشكر ملتقى المؤسسات العربية الداعمة لتنظيم هاي الندوة. شكرا نائلة وشكرا هبة على كل الجهد في التنظيم، لأنه برأيي هذا قضية مهم جدا. وممكن أبدأ بنقطة صغيرة شيرين، هل عملنا في المجتمع المدني هو مهنة أم حياة؟ وممكن هاي الإجابة أساسية في تحديد هل إحنا فقط موظفين وعاملين في هذه المنظمات أم نحن نعمل بقناعة تامة بالمبادئ الأساسية اللي تقوم عليها هذه المنظمات، بالتالي نسخر جزء كبير من وقتنا وحياتنا لهذا الموضوع. وشرطين صغار لفكرة المجتمع المدني نفسهم، إنه هل جزء من التطور العالمي صار إنه فيما بعد الحداثة، بالتالي المجتمع المدني بيشتغل في إطار اقتصاد اجتماعي وهناك شركات وهناك دول، لكن برأيي في الدول العربية ومن بينها فلسطين احنا لم نكمل بناء الدولة، وبالتالي لا يوجد عقد اجتماعي واضح يحدد العلاقات ما بين المجتمع المدني وما بين الحكومات او الانظمه في اطار هذه الدوله التي نسعى لتطويرها. وبالتالي احنا نتجاوز مرحله البناء حتى نصل الان للتحديات الحديثه من كوفيد 19 اللي اصلا كان في بشكل اساسي غياب واضح لدور الدوله وظهور واضح كيف اشار التقرير لدور المجتمع المدني والمنظمات الاهليه في العمل في الارض نفسها. التوتر الثاني اللي شيء هو تعريف المجتمع المدني نفسه، هل نحن نعمل في حقل سياسي ام نعمل في حقل خيري ام نعمل في حقل تكنوقراطي؟ وهذا الاشاره مهمه جدا، لانه حتى الحقل السياسي كحقل لا حزبي، قصدي السياسي بمعنى السياسه العامه هو مدخل اساسي لفهم الادوار واختلافات ما بين هذه المنظمات بالتالي، وبدأ منها فلسطين. فلسطين طبعا يعني تغيرات فيها كبيرة جدا وسريعة ومتلاحقة، فملاحقات احتلال دائما مستمرة، واخرها كان تصنيف 6 مؤسسات كبيرة حقوقية وتنموية بأنها إرهابية، وجرى إغلاق مقراتها ومصادرة معداتها واعتقال جزء كبير من موظفينها وتهديد البعض الآخر، إضافة كمان للممارسات القديمة من مداهمة إغلاق واعتقال لعدد كبير. لكن هذا مش فقط، كمان عندنا حتى كمان احنا ملعب كبير لتدخلات المانحين، ومن يريد ان يرى هذا التأثير عليه ان يأتي لفلسطين ويرى كيف يعمل المانحين في إطار من سلب السيادة للشعب الفلسطيني ومؤسساته بإطار ما يسمى بالشراكات وحقوق الإنسان وغيرها، وبالتالي تصبح هي خطوات كبيرة لتدخلات سياسية في إطار تثبيت فكرة السلام بين الضفرين كأداة لإدامة الاحتلال، بدل من فكرة إنهاء الاحتلال والتحقيق الاستقلال نفسه. كمان من ناحية ثالثة عندنا الانقسام السياسي اللي فرض كمان حرب من الطرفين، يعني الحكومة الفلسطينية في الضفة وحكومة أمر الواقع في قطاع غزة على المنظمات الأهلية القريبة من كل طرف، فجرى إغلاق عدد كبير من المنظمات الأهلية المحسوبة على كل طرف في المكان الذي سيطر عليه الطرف الآخر. وكمان جرى كمان يعني تطوير أدوات قانونية مثل قانون لمكافحة الإرهاب وتبييض الأموال، هذا قانون فلسطيني، وقانون الجرائم الإلكترونية اللي تم استهداف المجتمع المدني الفلسطيني بهذول القوانين، يعني جرى تصميم قوانين حتى تخدم الهجوم على المجتمع المدني وعلى النشطاء الفلسطينيين بإطار الجرائم الإلكترونية. أي شخص بيكتب شيء على الفيسبوك أو أي منبر بيتم اعتقاله أو اعتقالها. لكن الاستراتيجيات اللي بيستخدمها المجتمع المدني الفلسطيني هي واسعة ومتعددة، معروفة يعني معروفة بشكل عام، هي مش شيء جديد كمان، لكنها قديمة بحكم أنه المجتمع المدني الفلسطيني يمكن من أقدم المجتمعات المدنية العربية اللي حتى كمان وجوده هو ما قبل الدولة، قبل نشوء السلطة نفسه، فكان عنده مساحة كبيرة للتطور وتكون في عنده أرضية صلبة للعمل كمان. لكن احنا نشتغل بالأساس يعني من خلال الحوار مع أطراف ذات علاقة من وزارات، من حكومة، مجتمع مدني، مانحين، من الحوار لمسألة القبول والخضوع، وهي كمان لازم نقر فيها أنه في بعض المؤسسات تقر وتخضع لما تريد الحكومة أو حتى المانحين في سياقات مختلفة حتى تتلقى التمويل، وأخيرا وليس آخرا والأكثر شهرة هو الرفض والمقاومة بطرق مختلفة. فإذا يعني ما زالت سيروت المقاومة حتى بهذا المنحى موجودة برفض القبول ورفض الخضوع، وحتى أحيانا في استثارة العلاقة والتمويل والمنح والتضييقات لهذا الموقف اللي بيكون معلن وواضح، وهذا ما زال موجود، وهذا كمان يبشرنا خيرا في قدرتنا على إحداث التغييرات. يمكن النقطة اللي كمان مفيدة في الاستراتيجيات اللي سألت عنها شيرين هي إنه في علاقات واسعة قديمة متنوعة بين المجتمع المدني الفلسطيني مع أطياف واسعة في العالم، سواء مع الأحزاب التقدمية اليسارية الديمقراطية في الجنوب، في أوروبا، حتى في أمريكا، مع منظمات المجتمع المدني التقدمية والمتنورة تحديدا كمان، وفي هناك عضويات وشبكات في منابر دولية وشبكات عالمية ومع UN، وبالتالي هذا كمان بضيف نوع من الثقل والوزن لهذه المنظمات في حواراتها بتتم مع المانحين او حتى مع الحكومه الفلسطينيه لما يكون في هناك صراع، لانه كمان بيكون في هناك وزن لنقل الصوره كما هي لهذه الاطراف، وبطل في هناك حاجه لوكاله، فقط الخطاب الحكومي هو السائد. فلدينا خطاب قوي وواضح ومعلن بالاساس. باعتقادي هذه هي الاستراتيجيات، وهذه الاستراتيجيات بتخلينا قادرين لغايه الان نواجه التحديات الموجوده علينا من كل الاطراف. راح اوقف لهون حتى يكون اختم الوقت ونرجع نستكمل. شكرا.
Thank you, Firas. Shukran. I think this was very, very insightful, and I think your reference to, you know, how Arab states are still very much in the making. There's a book called States in Late Formation, and it addresses the emergence of state building within the Arab world, and that very much applies to all different countries, and Palestine being one of them, and has implications also for the civic space within those countries. If the states themselves are very much in that formative or the constant evolution process, then the civic space is also constantly evolving, because in some ways it is kind of the state's counterpart. And I think one of the issues also that the report can reflect on, and maybe through another report, is that that relationship between the state and the civic space in the Arab world. And as I was reading the report, the one thing that kept on coming up in my head is, where is the state, right? When we talk about the growth of the civic space, what do we mean by that, right? What does growth mean? How do we measure growth? Is it in numbers? Is it a matter of the number of civil society organizations per population, or against the growth in population? Or is it more a growth that is kind of vertical rather than horizontal? Is it like a vertical growth where you start thinking about the civil society itself and its current state, and how effective and agile and useful it is? But again, those are all kind of ideas and very much drawing on Firas and Ahmed's points. So I'd like to move to Lebanon and ask Marie-Noelle about her own thoughts on the Lebanese civic space. In the report, the Lebanese civic space is kind of heralded as one of the most diverse civic spaces, that there's a diversity of areas, that there's a sense of maturity, if you will, of the civic space, in the sense that there's a focus on education, on providing services, on human rights, all of that. And yet the report also makes the point that it's not growing enough, or there's still a shrinking of the Arab civic space. So what are your thoughts on that? Has it shrunk? Has it not shrunk? What is the Lebanese civic space like? And if you could also reflect on the impact of COVID-19. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sherine. And thank you I'm always extremely thrilled to read research, as Naila said in her introduction, that is written by people from the region, on the region, and for the region. So I'm really thrilled to be here with you and the other panelists. Before to reply properly to your question, Sherine, I think it's important, but I don't want to repeat everything that Ahmed said. I think it's important here to start by defining civil society, because it's more than merely associations and the associative sector. And it really is much more diverse. Regarding the proliferation and the false sense of health that a number of figures can give us, I think here it's important to state, at least to give two points at least. First of all, the method. Where do we have our numbers from? For example, in Lebanon, typically you have to an association has to be registered at the Ministry of Interior, but also if the association has anything to do with agriculture, then it has to be registered at the Ministry of Agriculture, if I'm not mistaken. So you have no single database to really capture the reality of, and I'm only talking about the associative sector, noting that civil society is much more diverse, and that notably in the last few years, in response to shrinking space, we have really witnessed an increase of new, very old rather, forms of collective work, such as mutual aid collectives and so on. So people are also, and I've seen this also in the report that has been captured by Heba, that people are trying to avoid registration. So this is, I think, an important point to make, that the numbers do not reflect an open or a democratic civic space. And if we go from the starting point that civil society is much more diverse than associations, yes, civic space and civil society and civic space has been shrinking in Lebanon. Most of associations, if you want to start by these, are, like Ahmed said, very charity or service delivery oriented, which makes them either extremely technical, but also contributes to depoliticize civil society as a whole, and narrow and limit its role to mere delivery of services, or makes it also unable to fulfill its primary mission, that is being the main interlocutor vis-a-vis the state. or watchdog, depending on how vocal they would want to be. Also, another factor of shrinking space has been the financial crisis in the country. The collapse of the banking sector has made banks, I want to say, go absolutely rogue, holding the accounts of people, but also of associations' accounts, which has affected their impact and delivery. Needless to say, the control they continue to exert on payments to beneficiaries, wanting to know their names, whether they are Palestinian or Syrian, etc., etc. The provenance of transfers and towards Lebanon and from Lebanon. And there is also an increased scrutiny and control from the state to civil and civic associations and space. We've noticed in our civil society monitor and observatory that any association that wants the al-mukhabar, the small, it's supposed to be a receipt, but it's much more than this in practice. If there is any mention of or suspicion of any broader human rights or political mission, it will be systematically delayed or held up. Also, I think it's important to mention systematic smear campaigns from mainstream media, establishment party, the authorities, against civil society. Civil society is really like an insult, I want to say, in Lebanon. With all the negative connotations that come with it. Of course, the suspicion of foreign funding, but also everything around it, of corruption, lots of money, lack of accountability. And today, this has been very much exacerbated with the acute crisis, because civil society organizations are able to operate, and this is increasing suspicion around them. But also crackdown from the state towards parts of civil society. Political bloggers, journalists are systematically put to trial. There has been lately another crackdown on LGBTIQ and queer collectives and spaces, and widespread repression to social movements. Here again, I reiterate that civic space is much more than registered associations. I mean, just to go back to 2019, although it seems like a century ago, the last social movement have been very violently repressed by state and paramilitary apparatuses in Lebanon. In addition to, of course, scrutiny on trade unions, as Ahmed mentioned, and donor practices that are a very important factor in contributing to shrinking space. And the last point I want to mention, and I'm usually really disliked for saying this, I would say that a very important and sometimes overlooked, because we are all nonprofits and we don't like to wash our dirty laundry in public, but I think a very important factor of shrinking space is civic space actors themselves. We've seen from our research and on our observations, at least in Lebanon, this space being increasingly a space of competition rather of collaboration, and the rare experiences of collaboration or coalitions remain either time or project bound and really not organic and genuine, I want to say. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell. I hope I replied to your question.
That's great. Thank you so much. Marie-Noelle, you've pointed out a number of issues there that are important for us to consider. And I think that question of measurement is really, really important for the AFF to take up. How do you measure progress and growth within the Arab civic space? It would require an exercise first to define what that means, and whether or not there is an Arab civic space as such, or is it kind of national civic spaces that we're talking about, or is there, you know, a more kind of informal civic space that we want to tap into? But what is it? How do we measure its growth beyond the numbers and beyond the figures? I think this is really, really important. Marie-Noelle also pointed out the role of media or other actors that we tend to kind of not take very much into consideration when we're doing research on the civic space. I think it's really important to kind of pay attention to some of those key actors and stakeholders that are in the space. And then, of course, just looking inwardly at the practice of civic actors themselves and some of the barriers that are there. But I think at this point, it's good to go to Egypt and to go to Hend. And Hend, some of the comments that you've made in the report point out that it's the Egyptian civic space is very much reactive rather than proactive, is kind of reacting to the challenges as they emerge and not really proactive. What are your reflections on that in light of the report? Do you see the Egyptian civic space as having shrunk post-COVID or during and post-COVID? How do you see it becoming more proactive rather than reactive? Over to you.
Thank you, Shireen, and thank you, Naila and Heba, for giving us this opportunity in such a report. I think that as my colleagues mentioned before, I think we are the same in things related that the civil society is shrinking. Maybe the regions are different and the directions are different, but I think that we are reaching the same point. Of course, the civil society efforts are shrinking and they are diminishing. In Egypt, I think, and as I mentioned in my point of view regarding the report, that the civil society in Egypt before the COVID was working more towards achieving the SDGs and working on Egypt Vision 2030 and trying to work on sustainable development models. Not only because it's a political direction, but also because the donors, the international donors and international organizations working in programs in Egypt were allocating the funds towards this way. And maybe this is the intervention that happened that made them working on this directions. Since the COVID came out, of course, we work more according to, since we are a big population, I think that we in Egypt are different than the previous experiences in other countries because of the big population. So when the COVID hit Egypt, maybe the problem of poor healthcare sector services, number of hospitals, number of services that is provided, made all efforts work towards the health sector and in the COVID. So all the agendas, they didn't work parallel related to the sustainable development program that were already running. And all the efforts went on the other side, which made, I think that we are in a gap that was made after COVID, and that we are trying now to recap. But this recap will be difficult to return as before, because mainly, as you were mentioning in measuring the growth in the civil society, I think in Egypt, the number of civil society organizations is more than 50,000 that are in the Ministry of Solidarity, yet the ones that are active are minimum. and they diminished also after the COVID, as I said, because they didn't find sources of funding. The donors and the international organizations stopped many of the CSR activities that were working in the private companies, stopped also because the financial crisis hit everything, even the private sector, and the private sector was a big portion also of the funds that were used by the civil society, so they quitted the market. Maybe the NGOs or the civil society organizations are still there, yet their activities is minimum now. Their impact on the development field in Egypt is unmeasurable. I'm talking about if we have this 50,000, I think 30% of them, and this is a number that came out from CapMass, 30% only from them is the working number, and maybe much more less that are working on development programs that are working in the right direction towards sustainability, building the resilience of the civil society and building the resilience of the community itself towards anything that might happen again, like the COVID. But this is the thing that maybe it was mentioned many times after the COVID, how can we build the resilience of the civil society so that they can react in any disaster that may happen again in a better way. Yet it was not achieved, and I think that this was mentioned in many programs, yet the ones that are working on the ground, I think that they are minimum and they didn't work to complete the scope of work.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Hend. I mean, yeah, the resilience of the Egyptian civic space is an important area for consideration. Again, I go back to questioning a lot of those terms. What do we mean by resilience within the civic space from a national perspective or an Arab perspective? It tends to be a term that is used by Western donors, essentially, to push responsibility and risk to local and affected populations. And so there is a power dynamic inherent within that term that is also quite interesting to investigate. But I think at this point, we will go to questions. I had a lot of more questions to pose, but maybe there will be other opportunities to discuss that with Naila, Heba, and others. So I'll just go to the Q&A and take some of those questions that are there and pose them to the panelists and to Heba, and then close. We've got 10 minutes, and so I am trying my best to stick to the time. So the first question, I think this one is to you, Heba, is from Boris. Due to the restrictive NGO laws, people register as an economic entity or have a more informal organizational structure. Did you look into the specific trends? Over to you, Heba.
Yes, this is a very salient observation. We know that, and we have an example of social enterprise that works on youth in our interviews, but we didn't look at it specifically. Again, throughout the panel, the broad spectrum of civil society, we could not really, for realistic and practical reasons, cover the full spectrum. So basically, it was the NGOs, the associations, the foundations, faith-based organizations. But yes, noted, it is a trend, and to kind of circumvent and overcome these legislative restrictions, we do see a rise in the social enterprises that are, or CSOs that are registered as nonprofit companies.
Thanks, Heba. The second question is from Namat, and it is, what concrete advice would you give family firms practicing philanthropy to change in their giving strategies to become more resilient in a multiple crisis context? Is it only focusing on the financial aspect? So I'm not sure who's interested in taking that question. Any of the panelists, just raise your hand up if you're interested to go for it. It's about family firms in particular. Firas, over to you.
Okay, I think شكرا. اعتقد البدايه بتكون على الاقل وجود توجه واضح يعني للشركات العائليه في مساله يعني التمويل والتبرع والعمل بين قوسين الخيري، لكن أنا بفضل يكون في إطار التنمية وحقوق الإنسان. طبعا احنا عندنا مشكلة أساسية في العالم العربي إنه بغياب هذه الأشكال بشكل منظم، وإن كانت موجودة هي بإطار بعض أنواع المسؤولية الاجتماعية للشركات، وتأتي أكثر بإطار الدعاية للشركة أكثر منها بالفعل، يعني لتحقيق أهداف ممكن أكثر من الشركات العربية في المهجر لكن أنا برأيي يكون في هناك شراكة، ويكون هناك كمان في رؤية وأجندة واضحة لهذه الشركات، وهذه الشركات تكون مبنية على وجود أهداف مشتركة، حتى ما يكون المسألة هي فقط ترويج أو يعني جزء من خصم ضريبي لبعض الشركات بالأساس. هذا ردي باختصار كيف بشوف أنا أعتقد هذه المسألة.
Okay. The next question is from Baptiste, and I'm selecting questions. I might go back to the earlier ones again if we've got time. Baptiste's question is about the localization agenda. It's an interesting framework. It definitely, however, does not address many root causes of CSO challenges that are much broader than the humanitarian landscape alone. Development international actors have a broader role and responsibility to play. There's a missing link in the sequence that should be tackled. Could a coalition at humanitarian level fostered by the relocalization agenda trigger the nexus humanitarian development necessary for engagement? And I think this is a question that, I mean, the nexus question is a really old one, but it's still very pertinent today because the original intent behind is still very relevant. Is there a scope for a humanitarian development nexus? Anybody interested in taking that question? Again, just raise your hand. Ahmed, over to you.
يعني شكرا للصديق بابتيس على إثارة هذا الموضوع. يعني موضوع اللوكاليزيشن أو المحلية باللغة العربية يمكن تكون هي أكثر من التوطين. موضوع حساس، يعني أنا تقديري حساس لأنه أحيانا ممكن يحطنا بصف مباشر مقابل لأدوار منظمات المجتمع المدني الدولية والعالمية اللي تشتغل في بلداننا، وبالتالي علينا التعامل مع هذا المفهوم بحساسية. أدوار هاي المنظمات جدا مهم في تعزيز مسارات التنمية وتعزيز حقوق الإنسان، وبحاجة لدعم، وهي أيضا تواجه قيود عديدة في عملها. أيضا منظمات المجتمع المدني المحلية تواجه نفس القضايا. هذا الموضوع أثير بشكل كبير خلال الفترة الماضية في الأردن، لأنه القيود الحكومية على عمل منظمات المجتمع المدني الأردنية في بعض المجالات، وعلى وجه الخصوص قضايا اللاجئين والعمل داخل المخيمات اللاجئين، هو اللي أثار هذا الموضوع في الأردن مؤخرا. ولكن أنا تقديري مطلوب تعزيز قدرات منظمات المجتمع المدني المحلية للقيام بأدوار أوسع، ونقل المعارف من منظمات المجتمع المدني العالمية لتوسيع ونقل خبراتها لتعزيز قدرات منظمات المجتمع المدني المحلية، إلا أنه يجب التعامل مع هذا الموضوع بحساسية لكي لا نجد أنفسنا كمنظمات مجتمع مدني محلية بمقابل منظمات المجتمع المدني العالمية. احنا أدوارنا مكملة لبعضها البعض، وعلينا أن نستفيد من خبرات بعضنا البعض ومن الأدوات المتاحة لكل منا للعمل في هذا المجال.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ahmed, for your response. Let's take one more question and then close. And it's about resilience. And it's it basically says, do you consider safety support? I think legal, digital, and psychosocial support, along with financial and technical support, needed to increase organizational resilience. And again, we go back to that resilience question. What is it, and what are the requirements for it to happen? Any reflections on what kind of support is needed to enhance organizational resilience in the Arab world? Heba, over to you.
I think what the report emphasized was there's a dearth of a holistic investment in CSO capacities, and throughout the chat, also the question from Namat also points to this, that the family firms, whatever the type of giving, the donors, the holistic investment, integrated investment that emanates from the agenda of or the needs of civil society, that is really missing. Whether it's psychological, support, whether it's digital infrastructure. It has to really come from the bottom up.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Heba. Naila has asked me to kind of close the session because we've only got 3 more minutes. Firas, over to you. You've got 1 more interjection. Over to you.
طيب بس تعقيب صغير حول الجلد، يعني مسألة الجلد اللي هي الريزيلينس مقابل الصمود اللي احنا نستخدمها في المجتمع المدني الفلسطيني، ومن ثم المقاومة، لأن هذا كمان أعتقد الريزيستنس كان مطروح في الأسئلة الموجودة. واعتقد فكره الريزيلينس او الجلد هي فكره التحمل او تحمل الضغوط يعني والكوارث والمشاكل هاي، وهي بتقدم فكره سلبيه بالاساس، لانه جزء من شغلنا هو باتجاه الصمود ومن ثم المقاومه، تغيير الواقع لواقع افضل لمجتمعاتنا، للناس الموجودين، لكل الفئات الاجتماعيه، مقاومه اي ضغوط سياسيه ومقاومه اي انحرافات براينا عن اجندتنا اللي بتكون موجوده. فاذا على الأقل أنا برأيي إنه أي تعريف محايد هو تعريف سلبي في سياق عملنا المجتمع المدني الفلسطيني، وبالتالي حتى أجندتنا المفروض تقاوم هذا النوع من الأشياء. يعني نجي نحكي عن مسألة التجارة العالمية، هل هي مسألة إيجابية للشعوب العربية أم هي مسألة تأخذ عم تسحب من ثرواتنا، مسألة الثروات اللي موجودة، النفط والغاز وغيره وغيره. إذا هاي قضايا بحاجة نعالجها ونفكر فيها في إطار أوسع من فكرة يعني التكيف السلبي لمسألة المبادرة الإيجابية بإطار الصمود، والمقاومة في حال وجود كمان برأي تدخلات سافرة ومباشرة كمان من أطراف موجودة. وعم نشوف مجتمعاتنا الآن في أزمة مثلا هائلة الحجم في سوريا واليمن، وهي نتاج مش مطلوب منهم ريزيلينس، مطلوب منهم مقاومة، مطلوب منهم تغيير واقعهم لإنهاء هذه حالة الصراع والنزاع. شكرا.
Thank you, Firas. And I think that the idea that you put forward, the idea of changing the realities that we're part of, that we live in, is an important one. And what are the means and the pathways and the coalitions that need to be put in place in order to enable that changing of reality, which is very much at the heart of what the civic space is about. It's about change, positive change. On this note, you know, I would like to end the session and just point out kind of 3 key takeaways. The first one is that we need more research like this. Definitely. We need more research from the region, about the region, that is in touch with the nuances and the depth of and the specificities of the issues that are encountered within that part of the world, that the data gap is real and it is important and that it needs to get filled. That there are issues around measurement and the lexicon or the vocabulary that we're using around growth, around resilience, around the civic space, that maybe it's an exercise by the AFF to define those and give them a lot more, you know, nuance and re-anchor them within the region. I think there is definitely a need for that. And the report does kind of push us to start thinking into that direction. And then the last thing is that, yes, there are restrictions. I think all of us agree that there are restrictions. They've been there for a very long time. They shifted and they changed, but they're there. But the civic space is still very much present and very much needed to address a lot of issues related to socioeconomic recovery and cultural needs for Arab populations. And so on this positive note, I would like to thank you all, thank all the panelists, all the participants, everybody who's joined this discussion. Thank you so much for staying with us, and I hope you found it interesting. A big thank you, of course, to Naila and Heba again for leading this effort and pushing this forward. It's very difficult to develop that kind of research in the region. It's not an easy task at all, and we're very, very grateful to them. A big thank you also to Walid and Adam also for the interpretation, which was great. Thank you so much, and I hope that we hear from the AFF again with forthcoming discussions. And have a lovely day. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shireen. Thank you so much for excellent moderation. Thank you to all the panelists.
Bye-bye.
شكرا. مع السلامة.
سلامة. Bye-bye.
شكرا.